objectives of the presentation today are really just to give everyone an idea of what regulations may apply to research involving drugs, devices, and biologics, and then also understand how those requirements apply in the research setting. And then I'll provide some tools at the end that are useful for navigating these requirements. And throughout, I'll provide kind of my practical thoughts on how the FDA regulatory requirements apply and what that means for studies. So before we begin, I have a few disclaimers and some things to think about that I want to put forward initially. So the first thing is that the FDA regulates a lot of different things. Foods, drugs, devices, supplements, animal products, you name it, you ingest it, you put it on your body, the FDA probably has a role in overseeing it. And they oversee these things in a lot of different ways. They're used in research, manufacturing, marketing, and post-approval requirements. The focus of the presentation today is going to be on the regulations that apply to the research use of drugs and devices. So really using drugs and devices with human subjects. And those are the regulations that are highlighted in yellow up on the screen right now. And so it's also important to note that there are other regulations that apply to clinical studies. So for example, or to the development of drugs and devices that will be used in clinical studies. So as an example, there may be good laboratory practice requirements when you're doing bench testing of drugs or devices, or if you're involved in designing a drug or device, there may be good manufacturing practice that applies to that development process. That is really outside of the scope of what we're going to be discussing today, but I would be happy to discuss kind of any questions that anyone has about that at any time in the future. Feel free to contact me. But again, the focus of this presentation is really on how you're going to be using drugs and devices in a research setting in human subjects. So some of the things that I want you to think about as you're going through and presenting is that, and one of the things that I hope that you come out of this presentation understanding is that the FDA regulations are really very general, which means that they can apply even if it doesn't seem obvious that they should apply to your clinical research. So as you're considering developing a study, it's good to consider the following questions. They are all related and overlapping, but honestly, if you answer any of these questions yes, then you may find yourself needing to comply with some component of the FDA regulations, and we'll go on to discuss kind of what those might be and how those apply. And then I also want to note, and this is very important, but when you're developing a protocol, you should really focus on what you need to do to achieve the aims of your research study. I recommend not trying to write a protocol to avoid applying FDA regulatory requirements. I can tell you from experience that it doesn't work. If you're evaluating a device, there is really no way for you to wordsmith your way around the fact that you're evaluating the device. So the best thing to do is just design the study with the results that you want to achieve, and then my office can help you make sure that you're following the regulations that would apply to that drug or device study. So the first thing that I want to talk about today is going to be drugs and biologics. And the presentation is really broken down into three parts. We're going to talk about drug and device requirements. We're going to talk about their drug and biologic requirements, device requirements, and then we'll talk about requirements that apply generally, whether or not it's a drug or device study. At the end of each of these sections, I will pause just in case anyone has any questions about what I was discussing during that component. I'll also leave time at the end, as Kevin mentioned, if there are any sort of general or specific questions. And one thing to note too is that the regulations are written differently. So why I'm breaking it down in this way is because based on how the regulations are defined, there are different requirements that can apply. So you can't really look at a study and say, these are the regulations going to apply because I'm doing a research study. You really have to look at, are you using a drug, are you using a device, and then how do the regulations apply to your specific use of that drug and the device in the study. So beginning with drugs and biologics, it probably helps to start with a definition. So the definition of a drug is very broad, and that's any article intended for the use in the diagnosis, cure, mitigation, treatment, or prevention of disease, and any sort of articles intended to affect the structure or function of the body. So again, very broad. Pretty much anything that you can think of could potentially be a drug, either depending on how you're intending to use it or how it interacts with the human body generally. So as a note here, it can include things like nutritional supplements and food, again, depending on how you're going to use it. And then I'll also note the definition of a biologic. And I'm not going to read that definition. I think the key to take out of this is that when you think about a drug, that is a chemical, typically a chemical entity. When you think about a biologic, that is generally going to include some sort of organic compound. Now, the FDA regulates these differently for marketing purposes, specifically, and what you would need to do to get approval for the drugs. For research purposes, they all fall under the IND requirements. So they're, as we discussed them, they're pretty interchangeable as it relates to their use in research. Where you're going to see differences is if you needed to submit an IND for a biologic, there might be some different testing that you need to do to make sure that any sort of inorganic materials are removed from that before you inject it into a subject. So you could derive it from a plant. There are all sorts of guidances that you would need to go through to ensure that any sort of chemicals that get sprayed on those plants are removed from the final product to, again, reduce risks of subjects. Not something you have to worry as much about when you're talking about synthetic products and chemicals that make up drugs. There are also two different centers within the FDA that review these different types of drugs or biologics, depending on if it's a drug or biologic. So they have expertise in those particular areas. So the first question that we have, whether or not it's a drug or a biologic, is, does the study involve a clinical investigation? Because if a study involves a clinical investigation, then it would be a drug study, and we'd have to go through the IND regulations. So a clinical investigation under 21 CFR 812.3 is any experiment in which a drug is administered or dispensed to one or more human subjects. That includes any, in this case, an experiment is any use of a drug except for the use of a marketed drug in the course of medical practice. And that's a key component of this. And I mentioned originally that the FDA's definitions can be pretty broad, and this is an example of the FDA's definition in the regulations being very broad, because specifically it says an experiment is any use of a drug outside of the use of a drug in medical practice, which means that any use of a drug that is dictated by the protocol, whether or not the drug is actually being evaluated as part of the study, is subject to the IND requirements. Now, there are some exceptions to that, and I think the big exception that I want to note here is sort of incidental use of drugs as a result of a protocol that are provided at the discretion of a medical provider. So as an example, if you're doing a study of comparing two different surgeries, that those surgeries are going to require anesthesia. Just because anesthesia is involved in the surgical intervention does not mean that the use of that anesthesia would fall under the drug regulations. Again, the anesthesia in that case would be used for medical purposes as dictated by the anesthesiologist utilizing the agents. And so that falls outside of the scope of the protocol, and that falls outside of the scope of the IND regulations. Other examples would be if a subject ends up getting a headache because of some of the interventions that are involved in a study, and the physician recommends that they take ibuprofen. Just because the physician recommended ibuprofen as part of as a result of someone's participation in a research study does not mean that the study is now subject to FDA oversight, because again, that was at the discretion of the provider. So again, very important to distinguish things that are occurring as a result of participation in a research study and things that happen at the discretion of a medical provider who may also be involved in the study. So now we know we're administering a drug as part of a research study. What does that mean for us? So we get into what regulations might apply. And so really things break down into one of two categories. There are investigations that require an IND, and there are investigations that are exempt from IND requirements. So pretty straightforward as it relates to some of the IND requirements. If you're using a drug or a biologic that has not been approved by the FDA, then more likely than not, you're going to be required to submit an IND to the FDA. There are some exceptions, which we'll go over in a little bit, related to radioactive drugs and also cold isotopes. But for the most part, if the drug is not currently marketed, then more likely than not, you're going to need to submit an IND. The other big category of studies requiring IND are if they meet any of the requirements currently outlined in the slide. So if you're doing an investigation to support a new indication or a change in labeling, the FDA is going to require an IND. If you're doing an investigation to support a change in advertising, the FDA is going to require an IND. And if you're doing something with the drug that changes the risk profile of the drug substantially, then the FDA is going to require an IND. So now these first two bullet points, new indications, changes in advertising or labeling, they're not stuff that comes up frequently with investigator-initiated trials because there's really nothing that you're going to be able to do in an investigator-initiated trial that's going to be used by industry to support a study. So really, we can kind of say those are bullet points that are really applicable to industry-sponsored research. If they want to pay for a study and they want that study to be utilized for FDA-related purposes, then they are going to have to submit the IND because the FDA is going to want to make sure that that data fits with all the requirements that apply to reviewing evidence to support marketing applications. The bullet point that applies most often for investigator-initiated trials is the route of administration or subject populations. So as an example, if you're using a drug in a cancer study and the drug is approved for one type of cancer patient and you want to use that drug in a slightly different cancer patient, it's kind of a variation of the disease, not indicated in the labeling, well, then more likely than not, in that case, assuming you're using the same dosage and route of administration, you're going to be exempt from the IND requirements because you're not really changing the risk profile of your use of the drug. You're just trying to get a better understanding of how the drug might help this population. So a lot of those studies, a lot of kind of what I'll call off-label use of drugs in similar populations in the same way that they're administered in their indicated populations end up being exempt from IND requirements. Where you are more likely to require an IND for a study like that, for a study that involves a marketed product, is you're using it in an entirely different population. So you're using a cancer drug to see how it impacts aging. Would be an example of a study that, even though it's a marketed drug, you're still going to have to go through the process of getting FDA approval because now you're administering it not to individuals with cancer to help them treat their cancer, but to older individuals to see whether or not it might increase longevity. So they're kind of really, when you're looking at that, the question is, how different is your use versus the use as currently indicated? And then same things with route of administration. If it's an oral dosage and now you're going to try and use it intravenously, then you're likely going to need to submit an IND for that because there are very different risks associated with those two routes of administration. So the more that you change about how the drug is used versus indicated, the more likely you are to need to submit an IND in order to utilize an already marketed drug. So now quickly go over IND exempt investigations. And the reality is, for lawfully marketed drugs, basically, if you don't do any of the things that I was just talking about, then you're going to be able to use that drug without requiring an IND. So again, It depends on the route of administration and the patient population. The one thing to note, however, is with the IND exempt study, you are still subject to things like IRB review and compliance with the requirements of informed consent under Part 50, which we'll discuss later. So you are, when we say you're IND exempt, or when we say you're exempt from device requirements, that doesn't mean that you're no longer FDA regulated. That simply means that you may not need to submit an IND or an IDE or interact with the FDA in any way directly in order to conduct your research. So these studies, everything that we're talking about today, will generally fall within the category of FDA regulated, even if you're not submitting something to the FDA. So outside of that big off-label use exemption, there are a few other IND exempt investigations that are possible. So if you're using radioactive isotopes and you have no intent to use it for immediate therapeutic, diagnostic, or safety and effectiveness purposes, then you may be exempt from the IND requirements. If you are approved by a radioactive drug research committee to so basically, for this exemption, the FDA has said if you have a RDRC and you get their approval, then you're able to move forward with that without having to go through the process of submitting an IND. And so this is really specific to drugs that are not currently FDA approved, because a lot of times if it is FDA approved, then we're going to be looking at the IND exemption for off-label use. The University of Wisconsin does in fact have a RDRC. So if this is something that you're looking to, something you're looking to do, if you're looking to investigate radioactive isotopes, then it would be good to meet with the RDRC to talk about whether or not it is something that would actually fall within their purview. And then they would, again, be able to review it. And in the case of radioactive isotopes, you'd also be subject to Part 50 and 56 related to IRB review and consent. And then cold isotopes are another example of exempt investigations. And they basically, this is an area where the FDA has exercised its enforcement discretion and said, we exempt investigations with radioactive isotopes. We don't, that's written into the regulations. We don't have similar regulations for cold isotopes, but the reality is the risk profile of those is similar. So as long as you meet the same criteria as radioactive isotopes, then you can usually use a cold isotope without requiring an IND. And in the case of cold isotopes, you actually don't even need RDRC approval. That's something that would be reviewed through the IRB process to confirm that those requirements are met. And then you would be good to go without submitting anything to either the FDA or the RDRC. And then I just want to make one last note on dietary supplements and food. So dietary supplements and foods are generally regulated separately from drugs by the FDA. So we're talking about things like vitamins, minerals, metabolites, herbs, anything that comes with a label that says this product has not been reviewed by the FDA, probably falls into the category of a dietary supplement or food. And whether or not a dietary supplement or food used in research requires an IND is going to depend on how you're using that dietary supplement or food. So it would not require an IND, as noted in the second bullet point, if you're only evaluating the effect of the food supplement on the structure or function of the body. So as an example, if you're evaluating fiber's ability to maintain bowel regularity, you are in fact investigating the supplement as a supplement and not as a drug, and so would not be required to submit an IND. If you are in fact using the supplement in some way to evaluate it to cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent disease, that's when you're going to fall into the category of the use of a supplement or food as a drug and require FDA approval to do that. And for the most part, the supplements and food products are not marketed, so approved for marketing. So you actually do not have the ability to apply IND exemptions to those types of requirements, even though a lot of times these are very low risk investigations. And the rationale from the FDA for that is if you're going to do a research study to potentially make a claim that a supplement might mitigate or treat a disease, then the FDA is going to want to review that to make sure that the study is of good quality, so that the results are useful. As one of the primary concerns of the FDA is making sure one, the rights and welfare of subjects are protected, but also making sure that that the results are accurate and usable. So as an example, if you're evaluating fiber's ability to treat chronic diarrhea, again, then you're evaluating fiber for its ability to treat a disease or condition, you're falling into the IND realm. And another one kind of thing to note about that as well, it can be tough to try and determine whether or not something is a structure function evaluation or a use in mitigating or treating disease. Typically, if you're targeting a population with a disease, you're going to be falling into the treat, mitigate, prevent a disease. Structure function studies are generally limited to healthy populations, in which case, then again, you're looking at it as a general structure function. So that's an important point to consider if you're working with supplements or food products. So a quick question for the group. We have a contrast agent that's administered as part of a research study. It's a basic science research to understand brain function, and none of the information collected in the study will be submitted to the FDA for marketing or advertising purposes. You can put this in the chat box, but who here thinks an IND is required in this case? All right, I'll just put it out there. In this case, we don't have enough information to know whether or not an IND is required because we don't know if it's an investigational agent. So this is a trick question. Because it's used for basic science, and because they're not intending to use it to evaluate or to use it for marketing or advertising purposes, it may not require an IND. It would really depend on whether or not the drug being used is investigational or not. So potentially. Are there any questions about the content that I just covered? All right, so now I'll move on. So now I'm just going to briefly discuss medical devices. So as I did with the drugs, the first thing we need to do is define what a medical device is. And basically, you can read it here, but in the end, medical device is anything that is not a drug. So really, when we look at the regulations, you're going to look at, is it a drug? If it doesn't achieve its purpose through chemical action or metabolized processes, then more likely than not, if it's involved in treatment, mitigation, cure of disease, it is going to fall into the device category. And if it seems like these regulations are very broad, it is because they are. Anything can be a medical device, as we'll go over in a minute here. So here are some examples of medical devices. We have our traditional medical devices that everyone thinks of when they think of a medical device, heart monitors, stethoscopes, bandages. And then we have non-traditional medical devices. So in vitro diagnostics. So blood tests are considered by the FDA to be medical devices. Software, depending on the specifics of the software, it can be a medical device. And medical mobile apps, again, as we'll get into, depending on the specifics of what the app does and how it's used. So just to give an example of how a medical device can really be anything, is a treadmill. So the treadmill that's sitting behind me is not a medical device, but as soon as you move a treadmill into a clinical setting and intend to use it for medical purposes, it becomes a medical device. So there are treadmills that you can buy that are GMP certified treadmills for use for medical purposes. So as I said, anything can be a medical device depending on how you're intending to use it. So now we know we have a medical device. What does that mean if we're going to use it in research? So as we did with the drugs, the question becomes whether or not it's an investigation as a device study. And as I mentioned before, the definitions are different. So for purposes of the IDE regulations, an investigation of a device is a clinical investigation or research involving one or more subjects to determine the safety or effectiveness of a device. So unlike with the drug regulations, it only mattered whether or not you were administering a drug as part of a research study. For the device regulations, it's not just that you're using a device, it's that you're also evaluating the device for safety or effectiveness. So one big kind of caveat with the device regulations is if you're using a device, and even if it's an investigational device, and you are not evaluating it for safety or effectiveness, it would not be a device study, and you may be exempt from the IDE regulations. In that case, as described here, you're using the device as a tool. So for the most part, if you're using an investigational device and you're not evaluating it for safety and effectiveness, and that device does not present significant risk to subjects, then you're going to fall outside of the scope of the IDE regulations, and you would be able to utilize that device even if it is an investigational. And we see that often at the UW with investigational MRI hardware or software, or tools used to kind of measure a condition, which again, not being evaluated. So can be used as part of the research study, but again, would be outside the scope of the IDE regulations. So let's assume for a second you are using a device in a study and that you're intending to evaluate the safety or effectiveness of the device. What regulations might apply? For device purposes, it really breaks down into two categories. You either require an IDE, which is split up into two separate categories itself, or it is IDE exempt. And I'm going to go through those requirements in detail here. So what's a significant risk device? It's a device that meets the definition that's included on this slide. And basically it boils down to, it's a device that otherwise presents a potential for serious risk to health, safety, or welfare of a subject. If your device meets the definition of significant risk, then it would require a submission of an IDE to the FDA before you could use it in your clinical investigation. And one important thing to note about device evaluations and the definition of a significant risk device is that the requirements don't only apply to the risks associated with the device specifically, it applies to the risks associated with the study as a whole. So as an example, you may be using a device that does some sort of stimulation of a subject. And as part of the use of that device, you may be doing something like a lumbar puncture. And so you're pulling spinal fluids to see whether or not your use of the device is showing up as being effective based on what's happening in the spinal fluid. In that case, the FDA would come out and say that that is a significant risk device investigation, because although the device that you're using might not present significant risk, you are presenting subjects with significant risk through that lumbar puncture, and therefore you would be required to submit an IDE to the FDA to get approval to use the device in that type of research study. It's not an issue that comes up often, but it's just important to note that it's not just the risks associated with the device, it's the risks that are associated with all aspects of the protocol that involve an evaluation of the device. I'm happy to discuss if something's on the margin. It's easy enough to talk through that. So if something doesn't meet the definition of a significant risk device, then it likely meets the definition of a non-significant risk device. As noted here, it's something that does not otherwise present a potential for serious risk to health, safety, or welfare of a subject, in which case you would only be subject to what the FDA describes as the abbreviated IDE requirements. You wouldn't need to submit anything to the FDA before you went and implemented the device. You would need IRB approval. You would need to convince the IRB that the device is non-significant risk. And if the IRB agrees with that determination, then you would be able to begin the study. And for the most part, would not need to submit anything to the FDA unless something unexpected happened. There was a serious adverse event, and in which case you would need to report that to the FDA. But again, as I mentioned before, this assessment is based on the proposed use of the device in the investigation, and not just on the device itself. So again, if you're involving procedures that present significant risk to subjects, even if the device does not, you may be required to submit an IDE anyways. And the FDA has a lot of good guidance on the significant risk versus non-significant risk determination available on their website. We'll make these slides available after the presentation so that you'll have access to all of these links as well. So if a device is not significant risk or non-significant risk, there are also the IDE exempt requirements. So typically, I did this in somewhat reverse order. When you're going through and you're doing an evaluation of a device, you're going to want to start out and see whether or not your device use meets one of these IDE exempt investigations. If it doesn't, then you would want to evaluate whether or not your device is non-significant risk. If it's not non-significant risk, then more likely than not, you're going to fall into the requirement for submitting an IDE. But there are IDE exemptions outlined in the regulations, and these aren't all the categories, but these are some of the most common. So if you're using a device within its approved indications or its approved labeling, then you would not be required to submit anything to the FDA. It would be IDE exempt. That includes anything that has a 510K clearance or a PMA, which is for significant risk devices. It also includes exempt class 1 devices as long as it fits within the indication of that device. If it's a device that's undergoing some sort of consumer preference testing, that may also fall outside of the IDE requirements and be IDE exempt, although that's relatively rare. And then custom devices are another category of devices that are outside of the IDE that are IDE exempt, although again, pretty rare for those investigations to happen. The big category outside of using a device within its approved indications that would be exempt are if you're evaluating a diagnostic device and it implies with certain labeling requirements, and if the testing is non-invasive, does not require an invasive sampling procedure, doesn't introduce energy into subjects, and is not used as a diagnostic procedure without a confirmation from another procedure. So the most common types of studies that are exempt as diagnostic devices would be any sort of in vitro diagnostic devices, so blood tests in particular. If you're not releasing the results and it's a simple blood sample collection through venipuncture, you would likely qualify as exempt as diagnostic under the diagnostic device exemption, and would not need to submit anything to the FDA and would not need to follow any of the abbreviated IDE requirements that apply to non-significant risk devices. Another example might be imaging analysis devices that are used for MRI. So say you're going to look at MRI images that were collected for clinical purposes, and you're going to run your software on it to see if your software is better at detecting some sort of condition than a radiologist might be. If you're not releasing those results and you're not actually having a subject undergo an MRI in order to collect data for the study, then you're likely going to qualify as under this diagnostic device exemption. And again, like the non-significant risk guidance, the FDA has good guidance on IVDs available. And we'll note it is the guidance is specific to in vitro diagnostics, but it is sort of generally applicable to any sort of exempt diagnostic device. It can be generalized a little bit. So even if you're not working with a blood test, it's worth reviewing that guidance if you think you might have a diagnostic device that could qualify. And so those are the main categories of device exemptions, but I do want to note that there is this whole regulatory gray area that devices are associated with. I like to say that the device regulations are really the Wild West because they're very complicated. The rules change somewhat frequently, and it's not always clear kind of how exactly to assess some of these sometimes. So the FDA is routinely putting guidance out to try and clarify some of this, but it can get complicated pretty quickly. So just I just want to address a few kind of devices that fall in this gray area that are showing up more and more frequently based on kind of where research is at right now in the United States. So one set of devices in general that falls into this gray area is software as a medical device, or SAMD. So this is software that's intended to be used for one or more medical purposes without actually being part of a hardware. So when you think about an MRI machine, the MRI machine includes both that hardware and the software and its approval. So they wouldn't consider that MRI software which is part of the device, to be SAMD. This is really independent software that acts as its own device. And so there are really three categories of SAMD. There's things that meet the definition of a medical device that Congress has told the FDA they can't do anything about. There's things that meet the definition of medical device where the FDA has said it's low risk, so we're not going to regulate it. And then there are the items that the FDA has said, these are the things we want to focus on because these are the higher risk devices. So to go through those pretty quickly, you have software that's not as a medical device. So really this is what Congress has said, the FDA cannot regulate. The primary category here that's most applicable is software that functions the software function that's intended for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle. The rest of these categories really fall into more administrative software, which I think as a general rule, the FDA would say we weren't interested in regulating those anyways, but Congress has now confirmed that they're not allowed to regulate that. So you don't have to worry about the FDA regulating electronic medical records anytime soon, hopefully. But again, the big category of those healthy, promotes healthy activities would be general wellness devices. So they present low risk to users. My Garmin watch would be an example of that. They're not intended to cure, mitigate, or treat disease, but just improve general wellness. So my Garmin watch tells me my heart rate, but it tells me that I'm not supposed to use that for anything but just generally understanding how I'm doing. And these products are not considered medical devices. So when you're looking at a medical device, or when you're looking at a device and you're going to investigate a device that might be a general wellness device, you just want to think about these specific factors. Is it intended to encourage general health or a health activity, or is it really targeted at a specific disease? And then also, is the product low risk? If it's high risk or if it's targeted at a disease, it's more likely to fall into the category of a medical device that would be subject to the regulations that we just described. But even then, as we talk about SAMD, we talk about devices generally, there are also the mobile medical applications, which are really software that's intended to be its own device, either run on a program like a smartphone, or potentially taking your smartphone and turning it into its own device. So the FDA in these cases, when you're talking about medical mobile apps, has decided to exercise enforcement discretion based on really what you're doing with the device. So if it's a general device really just there to help someone manage their disease or condition without providing specific recommendations, or there to automate simple tasks, the FDA said you don't have to go through the process of getting FDA approval for that, either for research purposes or marketing purposes. At an institutional level, you would still be required to get IRB approval if you're enrolling human subjects, but then we wouldn't apply the FDA regulations to those type of investigations. And here's just some examples. So using videos or video games to support movement, common checklists that are put on into a mobile app to help people in understanding, what healthcare issues they might be experiencing, and then general things to track medications or providing reminders. Those are all kind of low risk, patient-oriented apps that the FDA would say falls outside of the scope of what they're interested in regulating for medical devices at this time. Really, the oversight of medical mobile apps for the FDA is focused on software that's an extension of one or more devices. So you're taking your phone and now you're using your phone to create a heart rate monitor. That would be something that the FDA was interested in. Or you're connecting your mobile device to other attachments in order to turn that into a regulated device. So again, making a device work with an infusion pump would be an example of something where the FDA would be interested in that, because again, that's not low risk, and it's it has the potential to create more issues. And then anything that does patient-specific analysis or treatment recommendations will generally fall into the category of a medical mobile app that the FDA regulates. And again, these are pretty generic descriptions. The FDA has good guidance, which is hidden down in the presentation, but that describes specifically what the FDA is looking at and gives examples of the types of devices that would or would not be regulated based on the FDA's current enforcement discretion. And then the other big example of this gray area are clinical decision support tools. So these are broadly defined as tools that provide healthcare professionals and patients with knowledge and in person-specific information to enhance their healthcare. And honestly, CDS, as it's called, it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. There's a chart that's included here that breaks down where the FDA considers something a device or not a device, and where they intend where they either regulate it or don't regulate it. So for the most part, if something's directed at a patient, it is more likely to be subject to FDA oversight. If it's directed at healthcare providers, it's less likely to be considered within the FDA's purview. It really depends on whether or not the healthcare provider is able to discern why the device is making, or the clinical decision support tools are making those recommendations. And so it gets pretty complicated. So when you're talking about treatment algorithms, that's when we're getting into, is it clinical decision support software? Is it regulated by the FDA? And it's really going to depend on how sophisticated that algorithm is. So if you're talking about things like using any sort of artificial intelligence or machine learning, that's when it gets complicated. That's when a healthcare provider is not going to be able to discern why a recommendation was made, and that's where it's going to be more likely to be regulated as a medical device. So quick practice question. Subjects will undergo an MRI using investigational hardware and software. It's basic science research to understand brain function. Subjects will also undergo a lumbar puncture as part of the study procedures. Is an IDE required? I think the answer here would be potentially. It would again depend on, are you evaluating the medical, or are you evaluating the MRI hardware or software? If you are evaluating the MRI hardware or software, then it may require an IND because of that lumbar puncture, as I described previously. If you're not evaluating the hardware and software, then you may fall outside of the scope of the FDA's IDE requirements, based on the discussion that we had previously about using devices as tools. So it really depends on what your intended use is and what your aims and outcomes for the study will be, whether or not an IDE would be required. So a quick note, we focus then initially on IND and IDE requirements, but it is worth noting that there are also additional requirements that apply to investigations involving drugs and devices. Those include consent requirements and IRB review requirements. So as I mentioned before, the FDA likes to use different definitions. So the definition of clinical investigation under parts 50 and 56 are slightly different than what it is for the IND and the IDE. Basically, if you're planning to use data to submit to the FDA, if you're planning to do a study and intend to use the data from that study to submit something to the FDA or hold it in case the FDA wants to see it, then you're going to need to apply 50 and 56. And in general, it applies to what I'll say is it applies generally to all clinical investigations involving devices and drugs, because if it's IND or IND exempt, you're required under 50, the regulations require you to apply 50 and 56. If you're using a study and it's either an IND or IDE exempt, more likely than not, you're going to want to preserve the ability to use that data for future FDA submissions. You're already going to have to get IRB review and get consent based on institutional requirements related to IRB review and consent. So there's basically no reason to apply to not apply those requirements, and that's outlined specifically on this page. Really the difference is that result, if you do apply 50 and 56 to a study, is if you get electronic consent, you're going to have to follow part 11, which applies to electronic documents. There's some additional information you need to include in the consent form, and then if it is reviewed by the IRB under Part 56, then if something happens, if there is a serious or continuing non-compliance, that might need to be reported to the FDA as a result of it being a Part 56 reviewed clinical investigation. But all in all, in order to preserve the right to use the data in the future, I highly recommend just making sure that you're following those regulations so that you can use that data. So I just want to make a quick note about sponsor investigator responsibilities. And these really apply whether or not you need an IND or an IDE, or if it's IND or IDE exempt. The FDA is going to look at you if you're evaluating a drug or device as the sponsor or the investigator or the sponsor investigator. And so some quick definitions here. Sponsor is the person that initiates the study. The investigator is the person that conducts the study. A sponsor investigator is someone that does both of those activities. Now, there are specific requirements under the drug and device regulations, but they are generally, they're pretty similar. So I just want to just describe those quickly together. So if you're a sponsor, you're responsible for determining what regulations apply, and that's what we just spent the last 40 minutes talking about. You're also responsible for putting together information to support the use of the drug or device. So the kind of how much information you need to put together is going to depend on whether or not you need to submit something to the FDA. Obviously, if it's a new chemical entity, if it's an investigational drug, there's going to be a lot more background information that you're going to need to provide to the FDA. But if you're using an investigational device that's non-significant risk, you're still going to need to put that information together to submit to the IRB so that the IRB is able to agree with the assessment, your assessment as the sponsor, that it does in fact meet the non-significant risk requirements. So again, sponsor, if you're a sponsor, you need to figure out what regulations apply and make sure that you have all the information there to do that. If you're a sponsor of an IND or an IDE, then there are some sort of additional requirements that apply, again, that relate to the fact that you have to submit to the FDA. Those include amendments and supplements, annual reports, final reports, and those get really specific. So I'm not going to go through those in any detail. There are also safety report requirements, again, mainly applicable to IND and IDE requirements. Although, as I mentioned, for non-significant risk devices, if there is some sort of serious adverse event that happens, that would need to be reported to the FDA, even if you've never submitted anything else to the FDA. And then as sponsors, you're also required to maintain records as mandated by the FDA. And then also ensure monitoring of the study, which is important. For investigator responsibilities, these are a little more general. So you're ensuring that you're following this protocol as written. You're following any sort of applicable regulations. You're obtaining IRB approval as needed. You're reporting deviations to the sponsor as needed, and then you're doing things like allowing monitoring. And then maintaining. You're also responsible generally for ensuring rights and welfare of subjects are protected. And that you're overseeing the product and the investigation so that it is conducted accurately and safely. And so so I kind of ran through that pretty quickly, but what's the big sponsor investigator takeaway? I would say, if you are involved in a drug or a device study, your best bet is to follow good clinical practice. You're required to do that if it's an IND or an IDE study, but even if it's a non-significant risk device study, there are abbreviated IDE requirements that you'll meet if you follow GCP. And also, if you're following GCP for an exempt study, in the event that you want to use that data to support any sort of submission to the FDA in the future, that guarantees that you'll be able to use it. So I just again emphasize, if you're conducting research with drugs and devices, your best bet to follow to comply with all of the requirements is just to follow GCP as kind of a general standard. And so just some final thoughts on resources. We're going back to the beginning, as I mentioned at the start of this. So whenever you're developing a protocol, it's important to ask these questions. And if the answer to any of these questions is yes, then you're more likely than not going to need to go through and evaluate your use of the drug or device on the study against the applicable regulations. And so again, first question, are drugs, biologic devices involved in the study in any way? If so, then make sure that you're checking against the regulation. And then a quick note on resources that are available. So I'm supposed to be a resource. So please feel free to contact me in any way that you feel comfortable. We have websites. The program has a website. You can email me. You can call me. You can Teams me. I think everyone has access to Teams. So if you have a question and any way you want to get it to me, feel free to reach out. That is why I am here. That is my role on campus, is to help investigators and study teams understand what the requirements are and comply with those requirements. We also have general resources that are available. So just to shout out, the ICTR protocol template embeds information about drug and device requirements into it. So that's a good place to start if you're in the initial phase of developing a protocol. We also have IND IDE templates available, as well as a bunch of other resources that are available around campus. So the data monitoring committee, if you need someone to review your results for safety, if you need a study monitor, the centralized monitoring service has a study monitor available that you can hire. ICTR has a clinical research toolkit that includes SOPs and CRF examples that are highly useful. And then the FDA also has a number of resources available. So that ends, I guess, my presentation. So now I will open the floor up to any questions that anyone has.
Yeah, please feel free to unmute and ask a question or add a question to the chat. While folks are thinking about that, Jake, I just had a question. What if a study involves both drugs and devices? Which regulations need to be followed in that case?
Sure, that's a good question. And the answer to that would be it depends on what kind of device that you're using, what kind of drug that you're using. So for the most part, it would, if it's an investigational drug, then more likely than not, you're going to need to submit an IND. If it also involves an investigational device that is potentially significant risk, then you might also need to have a submission to the FDA related to that device. In those cases, it's possible to talk to the FDA to see if you can submit the entire protocol under either an IND or an IDE instead of trying to break that out into two separate protocols. And it also gets into issues of, is it some sort of combination products? Because combination products can be regulated as devices or they can be regulated as drugs. It really depends on their primary mode of action. And so situations like that where it's not like an investigational device, it is helpful, or where it's not clear that you're using a device as a tool or you're using devices as approved, it's helpful to get input from the FDA. So Kevin, there was another question that came into me directly. Does the definition of IDE include biological implants, for example, a cartilage allograft? And again, that's a great question, and it really depends of the primary mode of action. So that may very well be a combination product, which the FDA will then have to decide, do they want to regulate it as a device or do they want to regulate it as a drug? And it will be entirely dependent on what kind of the primary action is. So is it more like a device or is it more like a drug? And depending on which one it is, the FDA is likely to regulate it under those requirements.
Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, my name's Sandy. I've got a question. Thank you for that presentation, Jake. That's a lot of good information. I was just curious, so kind of when studies are starting up, if a PI has made a determination that like an IND isn't needed, is it something that would be caught by the IRB if we needed to investigate this further? I'm just wondering if there's kind of a double check there or not.
Sure. So the IRB is definitely going to be reviewing the requirements, and they're going to need to make a determination of, they're going to look at it and they're going to say whether or not they think it meets the requirements, or it might require an IND. And if they have questions, then they might ask me about it if it's here, or they might just ask you to go to the FDA to get confirmation that an IND is not required. I think the important point to kind of take out of your question is that if you think that a study does not require an IND, then you should build into your protocol why it does not require an IND. So that gets us back to the slide on IND exemptions. You would want to include in your protocol that you submit to the IRB why ignoring kind of you're not intending to use it for advertising purposes or marketing purposes. You'd really want to focus on why the route of administration, the dosage, the subject population doesn't significantly increase the risk to subjects or decrease the risk, decrease the acceptability of the use of the product. So in that sense, it either increases the risks or it lowers the benefits. If it does one of those two things, that's when you're going to fall into the potential category of requiring an IND. And the FDA does also have good guidance, particularly for cancer treatments, about when an IND might be needed versus when an IND would be exempt. But yes, the FDA or the IRB is definitely going to look at it and evaluate whether or not it is compliant with FDA regulations generally, and we'll get feedback from the study team or me or the FDA as needed to help make that determination before approving a study.
Okay, we've got about a minute here. Is there any other last minute questions? I'll just pause for a second here.
So not a question, but I just got a message that said, and as a good reminder, and maybe I didn't include it in my resources, but the IRB office also has a bunch of new toolkit materials that are available that you can use to help in making an assessment about whether or not something may require application of FDA regulations. So that's a good resource to look into as well.